participants of the IIC's 2020 Edinburgh Congress. My name is Talia Weiss. I recently received my MA distinction in managing archaeological sites, and I'm currently finishing my MSc in conservation, both from UCL. I would like to present a little bit about my dissertation project, which focused on changing the nature of authenticity through the sustainable development and adaptive reuse of historic buildings. This was done through an examination of the public-private partnership of the Carnegie Library Rehabilitation and Modernization project in Washington, D.C. I chose sustainable development and adaptive reuse as forms of conservation because I truly believe that historic buildings do not need to be frozen in time in order to be properly conserved. I think they must remain flexible to respond and adapt to external pressures in order to ensure their longevity and their authenticity. Washington, D.C. specifically is a historically dense city. It's estimated to have the largest percentage of total land covered by historic preservation protections out of any major U.S. city. The goal of my research was to analyze and consider the benefits between prioritizing the authenticity of a historic structure, following all charter standards, and adapting the fabric to maintain a contemporary function. This was done through the lenses of what changes to a building's legacy come along with adaptive reuse and sustainable development. How do we, as heritage professionals, as well as the local community, keep cultural heritage and historic monuments moving and flexible with their modern environment as a process of conservation? And how does branding and rebranding play into the legacy and material culture of a historic structure? I chose the Carnegie Library specifically because it was the first central public library for Washington, D.C., and it served as the first public library from 1903 to 1972. It also served as the first desegregated building, public and free to open for the entire community. The building was dedicated to the city and donated by famed philanthropist Andrew Carnegie, who decided that the building should be a center dedicated to the diffusion of knowledge. And this still holds true today, as it is etched into the front facade of the building. After the library closed 20 years later in 1999, the Historic Society of Washington, D.C. signed a 99-year lease to work and function out of this building. Despite this, no proper function and no permanent function was ever found for the building, and it began to fall into obsolescence, and this included any sort of funding for conservation or restoration needs for the building. But in 2016, Apple Inc. proposed the Carnegie Library Rehabilitation and Modernization project, and they signed a 10-year lease with 2 possible 5-year extensions to run Apple Carnegie Library out of the building. They fully funded this conservation undertaking, and in 2019, the building reopened to the public. It is now a space split into 3 areas. The first floor is dedicated to Apple Carnegie Library and all of its information centers. The top floor is the Historical Society of Washington, D.C.'s offices, gallery spaces, and library. And the basement of the building now houses a joint gallery space dedicated to the history of the building itself. My research methodology and framework was broken down into 4 areas: building observation, online questionnaire, semi-structured interviews, and online community responses. I spent many days just sitting in the lobby of the Carnegie Library observing how the general DC public now reacts, functions, and works with this new space. I also created an online questionnaire using the same questions as my semi-structured interviews, completely anonymous, that I disseminated throughout the entire DC public. I did this through LinkedIn posts, Facebook, Instagram, as well as my networks in order to get as many responses as I could. I conducted 10 semi-structured interviews with coworkers, supervisors, professionals, and anyone who had a front role in the Carnegie Library Rehabilitation and Modernization project. And then I looked into the online community responses on journals, articles, blog posts, anything that had to do with comments on the building before and after it opened and its complete rebranding. I took all of my quantitative data and I turned it into qualitative data using the Navivo software. This outputted 24 recurring themes that were generated throughout all of my data. Out of all of the responses and recurring themes, which included accessibility, functionality, cultural history, authenticity and inauthenticity, and preservation, the term positive preservation had the highest frequency rate. There was a lot of dislike towards Apple in this building, and the DC public did not like that a big corporation was taking over this historic structure. However, The majority of the DC public did agree that this was a great option for the building, and they positively reacted towards this preservation undertaking. One member of my interview responses, who served as a librarian for 30 years in DC, said, "If you know anything about this beautiful building and its perfect location, you would know that this is a perfect use of the space. It hasn't been a working library for decades. It is a decaying grand dame of the area. This was once a stunning library, but it now will house information receptors once again. I love it." In the end, every building holds different meanings. Every community views their buildings and their functions differently, and every individual within that community holds values differently. All of these result in varying levels of authenticity. The building also now bridges this massive generational gap. The juxtaposition between the new co-tenants of the Carnegie Library create a new fascinating and historic layer of this building, one that is once again open to serve all generations of people who walk into its doors. The function of diffusing knowledge and the dedication to the diffusion of knowledge for this building has not changed. The method of circulation has changed drastically, but at the end, there is still knowledge being poured to the general public out of this building. The Carnegie Library Rehabilitation and Modernization project epitomizes the practical uses of modernizing authenticity. When asked if this building is still authentic in light of the new phase and remembering all of the charters, one interviewee responded, "The authenticity comes from the fact that it's real. It's a real use of the building. Nobody is going to deny that this is part of the history of this building." To me, this building was a successful adaptive reuse and sustainable development project because the authentic lure of the Carnegie Library and the physical environment of the Mount Vernon Square neighborhood still remains familiar to those who have lived around it for long enough to understand and appreciate the significance of this space. And it was now conserved for, once again, a functional use for the community of Washington. Thank you so much for your time.